Hi, Journeyers. Welcome to A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. My name is Tony Carnes, your host. In June 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that there is not a right to abortion in the Constitution. And since then, we have had a great deal of controversy. And even now, the controversy is going back and forth. And we find this controversy over abortion around the world. There are over 100 countries that have some limits and some restrictions on abortion. Many of our immigrants from those countries have heard these debates, and the question is, what do they bring to the table here in New York when they arrive and after they establish themselves? Is that going to affect our debates? To help us to answer these questions, we have Professor Amy Adamczyk. She is a professor of sociology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She has done a study to answer the questions about what are the abortion attitudes around the world. Welcome to the program, Amy.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
You know, Amy, I set this up to think about this in world terms, bringing it back to New York. Is abortion a worldwide controversy?
That's a really good question, Tony. There's certainly strong feelings about it in many places. But in other places, it's not so divisive as what you find here in the United States right now at this particular moment in history.
Now, before we go a little bit further to dig deeper in this is an unusual research project that you got started on. I mean, I can imagine that you're sitting there here in New York and you think, I'm going to do a worldwide project to do a wonderful vacation. But instead, you take on this project, there's going to be no vacation. How did you come about to do this project on the attitudes toward abortion around the world?
Well, I was trained as a sociologist of religion, and I'm always very curious about the attitudes and behaviors that religion tends to influence. And religion doesn't usually have a real big effect on things that most people are opposed to, like rape and murder. I mean, there's some exceptions to that. But in general, religion's power is really on these attitudes and behaviors for things that might be considered deviant or moral issues. Things like abortion, views about LGBTQs, attitudes about prostitution, perspectives on pornography, maybe marijuana use. So I'm always curious about where religion really has its effect. And of course, religion is very interesting for studying views about abortion.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Does religion affect abortion attitudes around the world?
Absolutely. It's huge. It's one of the major factors shaping how people feel about the issue. I'm curious, does that mean that all religions say abortion is immoral? Or is there, is there some spread in that? And what do the seculars say in these countries? Yeah, no, great question. So all of the major religions have some religious prescriptions that can be interpreted as finding abortion problematic. Mm-hmm. And because of that, because all of the major religions probably could be viewed that way, what we find is that there's not a lot of big differences across the major religions. And when I talk about the major religions, I mean, the big five major religions: Hinduism, mm-hmm. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. One of the problems we have as researchers is that a lot of times we don't make more subtle distinctions across religious affiliations. If we did, we'd probably find bigger differences.
Because each religion has some variations, denominations, or traditions that sometimes conflict on issues or sometimes define it. In fact, I'm also curious about this question. We say, well, they find abortion problematic. But surely the religions come to that conclusion in different ways. Christians might say that, well, every person has a soul, including a fetus, has a soul. Buddhists might say you don't kill any life. It's a little different. Confucians might say you're cutting off your ancestors when you do that. Can you tell us a little bit about how people in different religions arrive at their
decision, can you give us some examples how they arrive at that decision that abortion is problematic?
Yeah, so a lot of times, people might have religious scripts or religious texts that they're following, and then religious leaders will pick up this information and sort of form it in a certain way. And for some individuals, it then becomes a really important religious prescription. So there was a time in the United States where Catholics were highly opposed to abortion, but even conservative Protestants were not especially opposed.
Well, I'm going to come to that right away, but I want to go back to these other religions. But how did that happen? The Catholics seem to arrive at this issue much earlier than the Protestants. We could say, why did the Catholics arrive earlier, or why did the Protestants arrive later?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this had to do with some changes that were happening in the 1970s and the 1980s that had to do with the religious right, and also just changes that were happening across society more generally. Things having to do with women's right, the evolution of the pill, the emergence of being able to get a divorce, the cultural wars that were kind of happening around this time. And so Catholics have long been opposed to abortion, but conservative Protestants really didn't pick it up until around that time when it started to get sort of ignited or encouraged to be an issue on which they could really embed themselves and develop a following around.
Did that happen? Maybe you know some polling data, but if you don't, it's fine. It's a little bit off our topic. But did that happen around 1972 when Roe v. Wade was decided? Or did it happen just before, or did it take the Protestants a while to gear up?
Yeah, I would say that it happened in the early 1980s and then became an even major force. So there was a little bit of a pushback from the liberalism that had come out of the late 60s and early 70s. And so the religious right then picked this up in the 80s and kind of grabbed onto a whole bunch of cultural issues, including abortion, but also views about gender, perspectives on premarital sex, certainly views about LGBTQs. There was a lot of other things happening in the 80s too, including the AIDS crisis and so forth. So all of these issues are sort of bubbling up, and the religious right sort of stepped in and said, hey, what's going on here? Let's frame this a certain way, and abortion was a part of that.
Also, maybe they discovered that it was an effective political tool to mobilize people. Because you mentioned in your study, and now let's go back to your study, that there are a lot of factors that enter into a person's abortion decision, but and I guess politics would be one of them. But religion, you found, would override many of those other factors. That religion sort of stood out. That when you controlled for all the factors or many of the factors, religion just stood out as being important in making abortion decisions, or at least in your attitudes. Is that right?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify that really carefully. So religion is huge for shaping the extent to which people think abortion is acceptable. It really doesn't have much of an effect on women's personal abortion decisions. And that might be a whole nother issue.
That is sort of, you mean that sort of, a woman could say it's wrong, but still, because, I noticed Gallup, I'm sure you're familiar with Gallup's polling. We have a lot of polling about abortion in this country. Gallup found that there was a difference between how they order their questions. If you asked a question, do you think abortion should be illegal? Then you asked the question, is abortion immoral? Then they add 10 points more. Abortion is moral. That is the placement of the question. In other words, the context starts to influence that. If it's an ethereal issue that, I think as a philosopher, a common everyday philosopher, abortion is wrong and should be illegal. But when it comes to concrete decisions, people step into a different plane. Am I catching that right, or do we know?
Yeah. I think one of the things that really made things salient for me in my study is the extent to which the context of the question really matters when you talk about abortion. And so you can go up to somebody and they'll say, hey, I'm pro-life or I'm pro-choice. But if they say I'm pro-choice and then you say, so is it okay to get an abortion in the third trimester? Oftentimes they'll be like, no, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. Or if you say I'm pro-life, then you say, oh, so if a a woman's life is in danger, she shouldn't be allowed to have an abortion, and then people tend to change their perspectives. And so abortion views, to some extent, are context dependent. At the same time, we can make some comparisons across nations, and certainly my research does that. And I think that that's a very reasonable thing for that work to do, that we can make comparisons. It's not so fleeting that we can't figure out the extent to which people are more supportive or less supportive when we look across nations.
How did you get the data to make these worldwide comparisons? It seems rather awesome that you're able to bring all this together. I assume there were probably some key sources or places you could get data about this. And what were those?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can imagine, collecting information about people's attitudes about abortion can be really, really complicated. Mm-hmm. It's not like getting information about the laws across nation. Every nation has, or probably just about every nation has, a law about abortion. Mm-hmm. That's not what this research is about. This is about public opinion. It's about personal attitudes. And to get that information, we have to survey hundreds of thousands of people. And so there's just a few collaborations out there that researchers can turn to that have done this sort of work. And I use something called the World Values Survey. And because so many entities are involved in that, and it takes so much energy to put together, usually once the data are collected, then they make that available to the public. So people like me can then use that data to try to unpack what's happening across nations.
If I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the World Values Survey was put together right about the time that the former Soviet Union was falling apart. And they were really asking what's going to happen next and what's going to happen in the rest of the world. So they put together this worldwide survey using scholars from all the countries. Am I right? Is that when it came out?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it came out in the 80s. And as you remember, 89 was very pivotal for the breakup of the Soviet Union.
So it came out right at a big controversial time. Yeah. And now they kept going. And so now it allows you to pick up on people's views in other controversial times.
Yeah.
That's sort of almost magic that you can do that. And so you use that, but any other type of data you were using?
Yeah, at the same time, so I'm using this very rich, very interesting survey data, but I'm also doing a bunch of interviews. And so I did interviews here in the United States as well as in China. And so, of course, I was supposed to go to China. I was supposed to be there in person, but all of this happened in the middle of COVID. What that meant is that I did a lot of the interviews over the phone. And so I was talking to experts both here in the United States, but also in China. We call them expert interviews. So it includes people like journalists. It includes medical doctors, people who perform abortions, as well as religious officials and academics, anybody who might have some insight into how the public understands this issue. And so you take that rich interviews and you mix it with the survey data. And then I also added to that an analysis of newspaper articles across 40 nations, including, I think, 800 articles altogether. And so combined, that gives us a real sense of what's going on and the factors that seem to be driving views across countries.
Well, you come back to the different religions. Did you find that in countries that have, let's say, Muslim religion is predominant, that they had abortion attitudes?
No, I really didn't find many differences across the religions. No. What was key is the extent to which people said religion was important to them. So even if they said it was important to them, or even if they were living in a country where a high proportion of people said it was important, that still influenced individuals. So you may not be religious at all, but if you're living in a highly religious country, that larger religious context can shape your views as well.
So let me piece these two things together. These two take apart these two findings. One is that religion, whatever the religion, has a very big impact on attitudes toward abortion. And if you happen to be born in one of those countries where the predominant religion is predominantly religious, let's say, that says abortion is wrong, and evidently they all say that, more or less, then even if you are not religious, you're influenced to say abortion is wrong also.
That's right.
I think you call that the crowd effect or something like that.
Yeah, contextual effect is the term
contextual effect. So so you would find that polling in the World Values Survey is going to pick up that even seculars would be against abortion, partly because of their contacts. They didn't want to stand out from their neighbors, or maybe they just never really, they just went with the flow. Maybe they didn't think about it that much.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you ask in your more qualitative interviews, did you ask how they, how other people's opinion affect them?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I was able to talk with people and sort of unpack what do you think is going on? And so when I talk to people in the United States, they would talk about the, media, for example. Well, there seems to be tinges of religion in it. And then they would talk about, in personal or informal discussions that they would have. And they'd say, well, religion would sometimes come up in these discussions. And so they were just sort of able to unpack how the religious environment affects individuals, even people who aren't religious at all. And I think that's really quite powerful. Because it helps us understand what's going on in places where people will say, well, religion doesn't affect me. Well, wait a minute. If you're in a religious country, and America is a pretty religious country as well, then that affects your views, even if you're not personally buying into that religion.
Now, that raises a question, is those that, of people's response. If those that are religious, that are against abortion, they probably should talk it up with their friends, because it'll have an effect. Am I reading that right?
That's a good. That's a good point, and I just want to add to that too. That when you're with your religious friends, if you have gotten an abortion, you're probably not going to share that information. And so again, that's another processes through which religion has an effect. So if you're, many women in America get abortions. We know this. We have data on this, but not many would ever talk about it. It's not a question. I can't go up to Tony and be, hey, Tony, did you get an abortion? You're going to be like, leave me alone, Amy. I'm not going to respond to that. So an interesting thing is that a lot of women who have gotten abortions will not talk to people about it. And they were certainly not going to talk to their religious friends about it. And then hence their religious friends are going to be like, well, we don't know anybody who got an abortion. That's not good. No, we don't, nobody's, And so it creates an interesting context whereby people think that this isn't happening, but we know from a lot of data that it is, that it's.
Well, then, if you're opposed to abortion, or if you're for pro-choice, that means you probably should talk also. But of course, you're going to get a conflict. But maybe you should talk about the suffering of people that had abortion, of their friends or something.
That might be the way to go. And of course, both sides of the abortion debate have talked about this.
I know. How do you, here they cancel each other out.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned in your study that in some secular countries, Europe, they're more. Their attitude toward abortion is not as negative. However, they all almost have restrictions that are more than what the pro-choice people in America want. If I can, I don't want to say there's just one pro-choice position, but their pro-choice seems to stop and be more conservative, we might say, than the pro-choice position in America. Is that true? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's a great point, Tony. And that certainly came up in the research that I did. I don't think I fully understood, like in other countries and in European countries, so these are rich countries, these are democratic nations, that often abortion past the first trimester is not permitted. And people might even find it problematic. So it's not only difficult to get, but people would say, well, that, no, you shouldn't go that far. Yeah. Whereas in America, for a very long time, we did permit that. And so that's an interesting contrast. Like, okay, so America, we've just recently changed things, but for a long time, we were on the more liberal spectrum relative to Europe. And now, of course, things are turning, there's been a lot of changes.
Let me ask you to speculate. I know that this is probably not so easy to decide, but speculate of, well, Europe has had a long decline of religion. Did that make maybe, so did that affect how seculars decide? That is, they're almost deciding, is there any relationship with decline religion and then the seculars also being comfortable putting restrictions on there? That is, they're not fighting anybody, so they put restrictions without feeling like they're fighting anybody about it. Is there a relationship, or do we even know?
That's a great question. I mean, I will say that in countries where we have lower levels of overall religious belief, then people tend to have much more progressive views about abortion. So we know that there's that linkage, that link is there. And I would say too that as certain countries become more secular, I think then people do develop friendlier views about abortion. I think there is a link there. But of course, with religion, there's so many other things going on at the same time. Usually, many of the richest nations in the world tend to be more secular. Not always. If you look at the Middle East, that's not necessarily the case. But so we also know that economic development also matters a lot for shaping people's views about abortion, along with religion, along with democracy.
Well, it correlates, but does it affect directly? Maybe there's some sort of correlation there. There's education too, of course, you mentioned that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say one of the things I was able to do in my study is to peel some of these layers apart. And so we know that even after accounting for religion, economic development and education can still matter for shaping views, and likewise.
Now, you also wanted to find out about religion and abortion in China.
Yes.
And you mentioned that. That's a pretty, would seem to be pretty difficult, and even without COVID entering in, it would seem pretty difficult. But you didn't find it as difficult as you thought. What happened in your China project, and how did the abortion attitude and religion sort of mix in odd ways there?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was interesting for me. I was nervous about doing research in China, and especially asking about views about abortion. I thought, oh my gosh, in the US, this is controversial. We can do it, and we should do it. We want to understand this issue. But is this going to be a problem in China? And am I going to get anybody in trouble? I certainly don't want to get the people I'm interviewing in trouble. And one of the researchers that I knew from China, I asked him about it. And he kind of laughed. And he said, Amy, if you want to ask about democracy, then you're going to get people in trouble. But abortion, people are going to talk to you about abortion. This is no big deal, and the government's probably not even going to care. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. They're just, it wasn't seen as especially problematic. Moreover, when I started contacting people, and of course this was during COVID, I had to do it, through various, electronic means, people were really open to talking with me, which was also a little surprising. But I think they were a little bored, Tony. I think they were a little intrigued. Who's this American researcher? This issue isn't that big of a thing. And I think they were like, let's just talk to her. There's nothing else going on.
You don't think they were spinning your tails, do you? They keep you talking?
I think they enjoyed talking.
I'm joking.
Yeah. And I will say, too, the Chinese rarely would take, I had a little bit of a gift card I could give them through a service in China, and they rarely wanted it. Every American wanted the gift card. So I don't know what that says.
We interviewed a lot of people in the former Soviet Union and in Russia, and it was interesting how we got very good access, as people were willing to talk. And in fact, particularly, we had a problem down in southern Russia, Uzbekistan. It was still part of Russia then, Soviet Union, and Kazakhstan. They wanted to talk too much. You couldn't. Our guys, we sent some people out, and they would say, you're paying us per interview, but they want to show you, bring out all their family. They want to talk about this, and then every question is a group debate.
Oh no!
And so you get one question, and it ends up a whole night's wasted away. But you didn't have exactly that problem.
They were very generous with their time, and I was really indebted to them.
How did you know who to reach out to? Because this was by phone.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had some people through university connections in China, and so I started with them and said, okay, well, who would you recommend that I talk to?
Okay.
And then it just we call it snowball sampling, and so then from there I would say, well, who else should I talk to, and who else should I talk to?
But you started with experts, but pretty soon you started talking to religious people too.
I did. I had a lot. The religious people were great, and in fact, at one point I had to say, I don't want to talk to any more underground. Yeah, it was too much. I've got it all. I heard all of your views. Yeah. So they were very open.
And the religious people, you talked to Christians and Buddhists, any other
Catholics.
Catholic?
I didn't talk to any Muslims in China, But I was able to talk to people that were part of what they call the underground church.
Yeah,
And-
over all these religious groups, what did they say about abortion?
Oh, so it was complicated. And you know, Tony, in China, abortion is a complicated issue because for many, many, many years, they had the one-child-only policy.
Yeah.
And that meant you could only
Not too popular,
Yeah, exactly.
but it involved abortion.
Exactly. And so there were interesting feelings about it. And it wasn't, China's not technically very religious, so everybody's going to be pro-abortion. That's not what I found. I mean, people understood that life is complicated and they had to do what they had to do. And at the same time, my survey data suggests that they are not especially supportive of abortion or supportive of very liberal abortion legislation. And I think some of that has to do with the government and the fact that often they didn't get a lot of choices over controlling their fertility.
Now, do you think on all of your interviews with people overseas about their abortion attitudes, the religious people I'm talking about here, do you think when they come to New York, they're bringing those attitudes with them? And what will happen?
Yeah, I think they are initially. And at least for a little while. And then I think over time, things change as they start to, be affected by the larger environment.
The crowd effect.
Yeah.
The context effect. Now, you've done all this. It's a huge project. I'm not sure it's ever been done before.
It hasn't.
And so this is really big news. How did it impact you personally?
Well, at the time, I was going through IVF treatment myself, and I became pregnant, and I'm now less a new mom. I have a 2.5-year-old, and so at the time, I knew a lot about pregnancy, and that was very much on my mind. I knew all the different stages.
So it became
so
a very heightened sensitivity while you're doing this.
Yeah.
Well, we're really glad you're here to share this with us, both your personal experience and the worldwide experience. Professor Adamczyk, we're really glad to have you once again with a journey through NYC religions.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Journeyers, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.